Before there was the loose cannon, before there were rumors, before fans debated where the character ended and the real man began, there was simply Brian Pillman. And if you were looking for warning signs back then, you probably wouldn't have found any. Because the story of Brian Pillman doesn't begin in chaos. It begins with ambition, the kind of ambition that follows certain people their entire lives. The kind that never seems satisfied. The kind that keeps pushing long after everyone else has decided they've already done enough. Brian William Pillman was born on May 22, 1962 in Cincinnati, Ohio. But from the very beginning, life wasn't exactly easy. At just a few months old, Pillman was diagnosed with throat polyps. Multiple surgeries followed. Doctors weren't even sure he'd survive childhood. For years, his health was fragile. The image most wrestling fans have of Brian Pillman is of a fearless risk-taker, a man diving from the top rope, a man flying through the air with no regard for his own safety, a man who seemed almost addicted to danger. But the strange thing is, his story starts with vulnerability. Not strength, not confidence, not fearlessness, vulnerability. And maybe that's important, because some people spend their entire lives trying to prove they're stronger than whatever almost stopped them. As a teenager, Pillman threw himself into sports. Football became the obsession. Not because it was easy, because it wasn't. He wasn't the biggest athlete on the field, he wasn't the strongest, and he wasn't the most naturally gifted. What he did have was intensity, the kind that coaches love, the kind that teammates remember, the kind that sometimes borders on obsession. People who knew Pillman during those years often described him as relentless. He wasn't interested in being average. He wasn't interested in fitting in. He wanted to stand out, and he wanted to win. That drive followed him everywhere. Eventually, it earned him a place at Miami University in Ohio. There, Pillman played defensive tackle. Again, not the biggest, not the strongest, but somehow always finding ways to compete against players who looked physically superior. It's a theme you'll notice throughout his life. Brian Pillman was constantly finding himself in situations where logic suggested he should fail, and then refusing to accept that outcome. It happened in football, it happened in wrestling, and some would argue it eventually happened in life itself. At Miami University, Pillman developed a reputation that would stay with him for years. He was intelligent, quick thinking, and unbelievably competitive. Teammates noticed it, coaches noticed it, opponents noticed it. But there was another quality people mention when discussing the young Brian Pillman: restlessness, a feeling that he was always searching for the next challenge, always looking over the horizon, always wondering what came next. Some people spend years trying to reach a destination. Pillman often seemed more interested in chasing the next one. By the mid-1980s, football looked like his future, and for a while, it was. In 1984, he signed with the Cincinnati Bengals. For a kid from Ohio, it looked like the dream had finally arrived. The National Football League, the highest level, the biggest stage, proof that all the sacrifices had meant something. But dreams have a strange habit of changing shape, especially when reality gets involved. Pillman's NFL career never became what he'd hoped. Injuries, roster battles, the constant pressure that comes with professional sports. Nothing was guaranteed, nothing was permanent. And eventually, The dream slipped away. For many athletes, that's where the story ends. They move on, find another career, accept that one chapter is over. Brian Pillman wasn't wired that way. He never seemed comfortable with endings. If one door closed, he immediately started looking for another, which is exactly what happened next, because around the same time his football career was fading, professional wrestling was changing. The territory system was beginning to evolve. Television exposure was growing, new stars were emerging, and somewhere in Ohio, a former football player was beginning to realize there might be another path. At first, wrestling wasn't the plan. It was an opportunity, a possibility, a second chance. But once Pillman committed, he committed completely. The transition wasn't easy. Professional wrestling in the 1980s wasn't exactly welcoming to newcomers, especially athletes who arrived from other sports. There was always skepticism, always suspicion. Could this guy actually wrestle? Could he survive the travel? Could he handle the locker room? Could he earn respect? Brian Pillman understood those questions, and he attacked them the same way he attacked everything else, by working harder than everyone expected. Early in his wrestling journey, he trained under veterans who quickly realized he wasn't approaching this like a hobby. He studied constantly, asked questions, watched matches, analyzed psychology, learned the mechanics, learned the storytelling, learned the business, and most importantly, learned how audiences think. That last part would become critical later, because while many wrestlers focused on moves, Brian Pillman became fascinated by reactions, how fans responded, how crowds could be manipulated, how emotions could be controlled, how a single moment could completely change the mood inside an arena. Those lessons stayed with him. Long after he learned his first hold, long after he wrestled his first match, long after he became famous, the seeds were already there. The curiosity, the experimentation, the desire to understand how wrestling really worked beneath the surface, and maybe that's where the mystery truly begins. Because years before anyone called him the loose cannon, years before anyone questioned whether his behavior was real, years before wrestling fans argued about what was performance and what wasn't, Brian Pillman was already studying the machinery behind the curtain, already asking questions, already looking for ways to push boundaries, already wondering what happened when you stopped following the traditional rules. At the time, nobody thought much of it. Why would they? He was just another young wrestler trying to make a name for himself, just another athlete chasing a second career, just another ambitious newcomer looking for an opportunity. But hindsight changes things. And when people look back at Brian Pillman's story now, many point to these early years. Not because the chaos had already begun, but because the ingredients were already there. The intelligence, the competitiveness, the restlessness, the need to be different, the refusal to accept limits, the obsession with understanding wrestling and at a deeper level than most people around him. Those traits helped build the star. But some people believe they also helped create the mystery. And the mystery was only just beginning. If the first chapter of Brian Pillman's life was about proving he belonged, the next chapter was about proving he was different. Because once he entered professional wrestling, it didn't take long for people to realize he wasn't approaching the business the same way as everyone else. He wasn't just trying to become a wrestler. He was trying to understand wrestling. And there is a difference. Many performers learn moves. Many learn psychology. Many learn how to cut a promo. But Pillman became fascinated by the entire machine, how stories worked, how fans reacted, how emotions spread through a crowd, how a single decision could change an entire arena. Those questions followed him everywhere, and they followed him north to Stampede Wrestling. For wrestling fans, Stampede Wrestling has become almost mythical, a place where future legends sharpen their skills before becoming household names. The training was demanding, the expectations were high, and the environment wasn't forgiving. If you weren't tough enough, people found out quickly Pillman survived. More than survived. He stood out. Not because he was the biggest man in the room. He usually wasn't. Not because he was the strongest. He usually wasn't. He stood out because he moved differently, thought differently, and approached the business differently. While some wrestlers relied on size and intimidation, Pillman relied on speed, athleticism, creativity, and risk. Lots of risk. Long before fans knew him as the loose cannon, they knew him as a man willing to do things other wrestlers wouldn't attempt, and sometimes shouldn't attempt. The flying attacks, the dives, the energy, the willingness to sacrifice his body for a reaction. It made him impossible to ignore. And eventually, it earned him a nickname, Flyin Brian. At first it sounded simple, just another wrestling nickname. But over time it became something more, because Flyin Brian wasn't just a character, it was a signal, a warning that this wrestler was willing to push limits, and Brian Pillman seemed to love pushing limits. Fans loved it, promoters loved it, and television loved it, because unlike many wrestlers of that era, Pillman looked modern, faster, more explosive, more unpredictable. He wrestled like someone who belonged to the future and began, and when he arrived in WCW, that future seemed closer than ever. For a while, everything looked perfect. Crowds reacted, management saw potential, commentators praised him, and fans began viewing him as one of wrestling's rising stars. But here's where the story starts getting interesting. Because success didn't seem to satisfy Brian Pillman for very long. It never had. Every time he reached a new level, he immediately started looking beyond it, as though achievement itself wasn't enough, as though he was chasing something he couldn't fully define. People around him began noticing it, the restlessness, the curiosity, the need to challenge expectations. Even when things were going well, especially when things were going well. Most wrestlers spend years trying to climb the mountain. Pillman often seemed more interested in finding another mountain, and another, and another. That attitude made him exciting. It also made him difficult to predict, because predictable people tend to make predictable decisions. Brian Pillman wasn't becoming a predictable person, not anymore. By the early 1990s, he was earning a reputation that stretched beyond what fans saw on television. Inside wrestling circles, people increasingly viewed him as one of the smartest minds in the business, not necessarily the biggest star, not necessarily the biggest draw, but one of the smartest. Someone who understood audience psychology at a deeper level than most performers. Someone who could see possibilities others missed. Someone constantly experimenting, constantly testing ideas, constantly asking questions, and sometimes the questions themselves made people uncomfortable, because wrestling has always depended on a certain agreement, a certain balance. Fans suspend disbelief. Performers protect the illusion. Everybody understands the game, even when nobody says it out loud. Pillman seemed fascinated by that agreement, not because he wanted to protect it, but because he wanted to see what happened when it bent, or cracked, or broke completely. At the time, those thoughts weren't obvious to the audience, but people backstage started noticing. They noticed how often he talked about psychology, how often he discussed audience behavior, how interested he was in creating uncertainty. And uncertainty became one of the most important themes of his career. Then came one of the most celebrated chapters of his wrestling life. The Hollywood Blondes, his tag team with Steve Austin. Years before Austin became one of the biggest stars in wrestling history, he and Pillman created something special together. The chemistry was undeniable. The arrogance, the humor, the timing, the ability to make audiences react. Everything clicked. And many fans looking back today believe the Hollywood Blondes were ahead of their time. But that's another phrase that keeps appearing throughout Brian Pillman's story. Ahead of his time. Ahead of his time as an athlete. Ahead of his time as a performer. Ahead of his time as a thinker. Eventually you start noticing how often those words appear, and you start wondering whether being ahead of your time is always a good thing, because sometimes innovation gets rewarded, and sometimes it creates friction. Sometimes people embrace new ideas, and sometimes new ideas make people nervous, especially in wrestling, a business built on tradition, a business built on hierarchy, a business built on knowing where everyone stands. Brian Pillman didn't always fit neatly into those structures. The more successful he became, the more independent he seemed, the more confident he became, the more unpredictable he seemed. And by the mid-1990s, something was beginning to change, not overnight, not dramatically, just enough that people noticed. Conversations started sounding different. Stories started sounding different. Descriptions of Brian Pillman started sounding different. No longer just talented, no longer just athletic, no longer just creative. Now people were using other words: unpredictable, complicated, unusual, dangerous. Not physically dangerous, at least not in the way fans imagined. Dangerous because nobody was completely sure what he would do next. And that uncertainty was becoming part of his identity, part of his reputation, part of the mythology that would eventually surround him. The strange thing is, at this point, nobody knew where the story was heading. Nobody knew the loose cannon era was coming. Nobody knew wrestling history was about to get one of its most fascinating characters. Nobody knew fans would still be debating Brian Pillman decades later. All they knew was this: something was changing. The talented football player who became Flyin Brian was evolving into something else, something harder to define, something harder to predict. And once that transformation began, there would be no turning back. Looking back now, one of the strangest parts of Brian Pillman's story is how many people describe seeing the change before they could explain it. Not a dramatic change, not an overnight transformation, just a feeling, a sense that something about him was becoming harder to predict, harder to categorize, harder to fit inside the traditional wrestling framework. Because by the mid-1990s, Brian Pillman had already accomplished something most wrestlers spend their entire careers chasing: respect, not just from fans, from other wrestlers, from veterans, from people who had seen hundreds of performers come and go. When those people talked about Brian Pillman, They didn't usually focus on his athletic ability first, or his matches, or even his charisma. They talked about his mind, and that kept coming up over and over again. His mind. The way he thought about wrestling, the way he approached storytelling, the way he seemed fascinated by reactions instead of performances. Most wrestlers wanted to know if a match worked. Pillman wanted to know why it worked. And once you start asking why often enough, you eventually start questioning the rules themselves. That curiosity became impossible to ignore, especially inside WCW, because wrestling was changing. The business was evolving. Television was becoming more important. Competition was growing. Audiences were becoming smarter. And Brian Pillman seemed to understand that before many others did. He understood that fans were changing. He understood that audiences were becoming harder to fool. He understood that traditional formulas wouldn't work forever. The problem was, understanding change and surviving change aren't always the same thing. As his reputation grew, so did the stories. Not scandals, not controversies. Stories. The kind that spread quietly through locker rooms. The kind that get repeated during long drives between towns. The kind that begin with phrases like, "Did you hear what Pillman said?" Or, "Did you hear what Pillman wants to try?" Because increasingly he wasn't thinking like everyone else. And that made some people nervous, not because he was reckless, not yet, because he was unconventional. There's an important difference. Wrestling has always rewarded creativity, up to a point. But every wrestling company has limits. Every promoter has limits. Every system has limits. And Brian Pillman seemed unusually interested in finding exactly where those limits were, then pushing directly against them, sometimes gently, sometimes not. The more he experimented, the more questions followed. Was he a genius? Was he difficult? Was he ahead of his time? Was he creating problems for himself? The answer depended entirely on who was telling the story, and that's another theme that would follow him forever. Nobody seemed to experience Brian Pillman the same way. One wrestler would describe him as brilliant, another would describe him as frustrating. One promoter would praise his creativity, another would complain about unpredictability. One fan saw innovation, another saw chaos, and somehow, all of those versions existed at the same time. It's one of the reasons his story remains so fascinating, even decades later. Because most wrestling careers eventually settle into a clear narrative. Hero, villain, success, failure, triumph, tragedy. Brian Pillman's story refuses to settle. It keeps shifting depending on where you stand, depending on what you believe, depending on which version you hear first. And maybe that's because the man himself never stopped evolving, never stopped experimenting, never stopped pushing, even when, it would have been easier not to. As the years moved forward, physical wear began accumulating, injuries became part of life, travel became part of life, pressure became part of life. The wrestling industry can be brutal even under ideal circumstances, and very few careers survive untouched. Pillman certainly didn't, yet even as challenges appeared, his obsession with audience psychology only seemed to grow stronger. He wasn't satisfied simply performing anymore. He wanted to manipulate expectations, challenge assumptions, create uncertainty. The reaction itself became part of the performance. And once that idea takes hold, everything changes. Because wrestling has always depended on certainty. Heroes, villains, good guys, bad guys. Even when the lines blur, the audience usually knows where they stand. Brian Pillman began exploring what happened when they didn't. What happens when fans aren't sure what's real? What happens when they aren't sure what's scripted? What happens when they aren't sure whether the performer is acting at all? Those questions sound ordinary today. Modern wrestling uses them constantly. But in the mid-1990s, those ideas felt, dangerous. And Brian Pillman seemed increasingly comfortable with danger. Not physical danger, conceptual danger. The danger of uncertainty. The danger of confusion. The danger of making people uncomfortable. Because uncomfortable audiences pay attention. Confused audiences pay attention. Audiences searching for answers pay attention. And Pillman understood that better than most. Maybe better than anyone. Which brings us to one of the strangest realities of his story. The loose cannon character didn't appear out of nowhere. Not really. Fans often remember it as a sudden explosion, a dramatic shift, a complete transformation. But when you trace the path backward, the clues were already there. The fascination with psychology, the fascination with audience reaction, the refusal to accept traditional limitations, the desire to challenge expectations, the willingness to experiment, the restlessness, the constant search for something new. The loose cannon wasn't a random invention, it was an evolution, the next step in a process that had been building for years. And once that process reached its next stage, everything changed. Because what happened next wouldn't just alter Brian Pillman's career, it would alter how wrestling thought about reality itself. Fans would stop asking whether a storyline was good and start asking whether it was real. Promoters would stop worrying about reactions and start worrying about control. Wrestlers would stop trying to understand Brian Pillman and start debating whether understanding him was even possible. The athlete from Cincinnati, the football player who refused to quit, the high-flying star known as Flyin Brian, was disappearing. Something else was emerging, something more unpredictable, more controversial, more difficult to explain, and more impossible to ignore. The next chapter of Brian Pillman's life would make him one of the most talked about figures in professional wrestling. It would earn him admiration, criticism, mystique, and controversy. But before any of that happened, before the headlines, before the debates, before the rumors grew larger than the man himself, there was this moment, this brief point in time, when Brian Pillman still stood between two identities, 1 foot in the career he had built, and 1 foot in the chaos that was waiting ahead. The wrestling world didn't know it yet, but the experiment was about to begin, and once it started, nobody would be completely sure where the performance ended. If segment 1 was about Brian Pillman becoming different, segment 2 is about what happened when everyone finally noticed. Because by the mid-1990s, Brian Pillman wasn't just wrestling anymore. He was experimenting, not with moves, not with matches, with reality, or at least the audience's perception of it. And that distinction matters, because professional wrestling has always relied on a carefully controlled illusion. Fans know they're watching a performance. Promoters know, fans know. Wrestlers know, fans know. Yet everyone agrees to play along. That agreement is what makes the business work. It's the invisible contract holding everything together. Brian Pillman became fascinated by that contract, not because he wanted to protect it, because he wanted to test it, and once he started testing it, the results became impossible to predict. Inside WCW, Pillman was already viewed as one of the sharpest minds in wrestling. People respected his creativity, his understanding of psychology, his ability to generate reactions. But there was another side emerging, a side that made some executives uncomfortable, because Brian Pillman wasn't content simply following instructions anymore. He wanted freedom. The freedom to blur lines, the freedom to create uncertainty, the freedom to make audiences question what they were seeing. At first, these ideas sounded exciting, innovative, fresh, but innovation becomes dangerous when it starts challenging the structure itself. And that's exactly what Pillman was beginning to do. He started speaking differently in interviews, acting differently in public appearances, presenting himself in ways that felt harder to categorize. Fans couldn't always tell whether they were seeing Brian Pillman the wrestler or Brian Pillman the person. And that confusion generated attention, lots of attention. Everywhere he went, people talked. What was he doing? Was this a storyline? Was this real? Was he acting? Was he serious? The questions multiplied faster than the answers, and Pillman seemed to enjoy that. Some wrestlers wanted fans talking about their victories. Pillman wanted fans talking about possibilities. The mystery itself became part of the attraction, which was unusual. Most wrestling characters are built around certainty. You know who they are, you know what they want, you know how they're supposed to behave. Brian Pillman was moving in the opposite direction. The more fans watched him, the less certain they became. And in wrestling, uncertainty is powerful, because uncertainty keeps people watching. It keeps them guessing, it keeps them arguing. Years before social media existed, Brian Pillman was creating the kind of debates that dominate online wrestling discussions today. Only he was doing it in real time, and not everyone appreciated it. Some people thought he was brilliant. Others thought he was creating problems nobody needed. One thing everyone agreed on: he was impossible to ignore. As the loose cannon persona began taking shape, something unusual happened. People stopped discussing matches. They started discussing behavior. Every appearance became a puzzle. Every interview became a clue. Every strange comment became fuel for speculation, and speculation spread quickly. Locker rooms thrive on stories. Wrestling always has. One conversation becomes 5. 5 conversations become 50. Soon everyone has a theory. With Brian Pillman, theories multiplied constantly. Some believed everything was carefully planned. Others believed things were becoming uncontrollable. And the further the character evolved, the harder it became to separate those possibilities. That uncertainty wasn't accidental, it was the entire point. Pillman understood something many wrestlers didn't. If audiences know exactly what's happening, they stop paying attention. But if audiences genuinely don't know, they become invested. Emotionally, psychologically, personally, they need answers. And Brian Pillman became very good at denying people those answers. The result was fascinating and unsettling, because the more successful the experiment became, the less anyone could confidently explain it, even people inside the industry. Some wrestlers admired what he was doing, others avoided it entirely. Some saw genius, others saw danger, and maybe the strangest part of all, both sides had evidence supporting their argument. That is what made the loose cannon era unique. Not that people disagreed, people always disagree. It's that no one could completely prove they were right. And Brian Pillman kept pushing forward, further, deeper, closer to a place where reality and performance started overlapping. A place very few wrestlers had ever gone before, and a place almost nobody knew how to control. By 1996, the experiment was no longer confined to promos. It was no longer limited to interviews. And it was no longer something only hardcore wrestling fans were discussing. The loose cannon had become one of the most talked about personalities in wrestling. Not because people understood him, because they didn't. Because every answer seemed to create two new questions. And then came the moment that changed everything. The moment that transformed Brian Pillman from an unpredictable wrestler into a mystery, a story, a rumor that spread across the wrestling world. At the center of it was WCW, and at the center of WCW was a growing tension between structure and unpredictability. Eric Bischoff was trying to build something bigger, something more aggressive, something capable of challenging the industry's established order. And Brian Pillman seemed perfectly designed for that environment, at least at first. Because Bischoff appreciated creativity, he appreciated risk, he appreciated people willing to think differently. The problem was that Brian Pillman didn't just think differently, he thought unpredictably. And there comes a point where unpredictability becomes difficult to manage, even when it's producing results, especially when it's producing results, because success gives people confidence. Confidence encourages experimentation, and experimentation sometimes leads somewhere nobody intended. As the loose cannon character evolved, Pillman began presenting himself as increasingly unstable. Not cartoonishly unstable, not exaggerated, something more unsettling, more believable. He wasn't acting like a wrestling villain, he was acting like someone who might genuinely be impossible to control. That distinction changed everything. Fans didn't know how to react. Commentators didn't always know how to react. Even other wrestlers weren't completely sure what was happening. And then the stories started. Stories about arguments, stories about disagreements, stories about backstage conflicts, stories about people losing patience, stories about people losing trust. Some were true, some weren't. Most existed somewhere in between. That's the thing about wrestling rumors. They don't need certainty. They only need momentum. And Brian Pillman generated momentum everywhere he went. Eventually, the situation reached a breaking point, or at least it appeared to. Because one of the most famous moments of the loose cannon era wasn't a match, it wasn't a championship, it wasn't a victory, it was a departure, or what looked like one. Eric Bischoff publicly released Brian Pillman from his WCW contract. At least that's how it appeared to the audience. And immediately, confusion exploded. Fans were stunned. Wrestlers were confused. Industry insiders started speculating. Was this real? Was Pillman actually fired? Was this a storyline? Had things gone too far? Nobody seemed to know. And that's exactly why it worked. Years later, wrestling fans would learn more about what was happening behind the scenes. But in that moment, very few people had the complete picture. All they saw was chaos. And chaos was Brian Pillman's specialty. The release created something wrestling rarely experiences: genuine uncertainty. Not storyline uncertainty, real uncertainty. The kind that leaves fans searching newsletters, calling friends, reading magazine reports, trying to piece together fragments, trying to figure out what was actually happening. For some people, it was brilliant. One of the smartest pieces of psychological storytelling wrestling had ever seen. For others, it was dangerous. Because once audiences stopped trusting the boundaries, where do the boundaries go? That's a question wrestling still struggles with today. Brian Pillman was asking it nearly 30 years ago, and nobody had a good answer. The rumors became impossible to control. Some claimed Pillman had outsmarted WCW. Others claimed WCW had outsmarted everyone else. Some insisted the entire thing was planned from the beginning. Others insisted it had become real somewhere along the way. The truth depended entirely on who was telling the story. And that's where the myth truly began. Not the Brian Pillman myth, the loose cannon myth, a version of Brian Pillman that became larger than the man himself. Because once people start believing a story, the facts stop being enough. They begin filling gaps, adding details, creating explanations, building legends, and every wrestling legend eventually develops multiple versions. Pillman's developed faster than most. One version portrayed him as a genius strategist, a man manipulating the entire industry, working fans, working promoters, working wrestlers, maybe even working reality itself. Another version portrayed something darker, a performer pushing boundaries so aggressively that nobody could confidently say where the performance stopped, and neither version ever fully disappeared. Both survived. Both gained supporters. Both became part of wrestling history. That's why discussions about Brian Pillman still feel different. Most wrestling stories eventually settle. People agree on the broad outline, the major events, the accepted narrative. Brian Pillman's story never completely settled. The questions remained. Was he creating chaos or becoming part of it? Was he controlling the narrative or getting pulled deeper into it? Was the loose cannon character an experiment or a warning? The answer changes depending on who you ask. And that's exactly why the story continues. Because uncertainty has a longer lifespan than certainty. People stop debating answers. They never stop debating mysteries. And Brian Pillman had become one of wrestling's greatest mysteries. By now, fans weren't just watching him. They were studying him, searching for clues, looking for evidence, trying to solve a puzzle they weren't even sure existed. Every appearance mattered. Every interview mattered. Every strange comment mattered. Because the possibility always existed that something significant was hidden inside it, something real, something accidental, something revealing. The wrestling industry had seen controversial figures before. It had seen rebels. It had seen rule breakers. What it hadn't seen was someone so committed to uncertainty, someone who seemed to thrive on making people question their own conclusions. And the deeper the loose cannon character went, the more difficult it became to separate strategy from reality, which meant the experiment was succeeding, at least from one perspective. The problem was, experiments have consequences, and some consequences aren't obvious until much later. The audience was fascinated. The wrestling world was divided, the rumors were multiplying, and Brian Pillman stood directly at the center of all of it. Not as a hero, not as a villain, not even as a wrestler, as a question. And nobody had the answer. If the WCW years were about creating uncertainty, the WWE years were about weaponizing it. Because by the time Brian Pillman arrived in WWE, he wasn't just carrying a reputation, he was carrying a mystery. Fans had heard the stories, they had followed the rumors, they had watched the confusion unfold in WCW. And now the most unpredictable man in wrestling was stepping onto an even larger stage. A stage where controversy generated attention, a stage where blurred lines generated ratings, a stage where reality and fiction were already beginning to collide. And Brian Pillman fit perfectly into that environment, at least on the surface, because beneath the attention, beneath the excitement, beneath the growing mythology, something else was happening, something that would become impossible to ignore. By the late 1990s, wrestling was changing rapidly. The old rules were fading. The audience wanted something different, something more aggressive, something less predictable, something that felt real, and no performer embodied that demand better than Brian Pillman. The problem was, reality comes with consequences, and those consequences don't care whether you're performing. When Pillman arrived in WWE, fans expected chaos, and they got it. The loose cannon character continued evolving. Interviews became stranger, appearances became more unpredictable. The atmosphere around him became increasingly uncomfortable. Not because audiences disliked him, because they couldn't fully understand him. There was always a feeling that something unexpected might happen, something unscripted, something genuine. And that feeling became one of the most valuable things in wrestling, because genuine surprise is rare, especially in an industry built around creating the illusion of surprise. Brian Pillman seemed capable of creating the real thing. That ability made him fascinating. It also made him dangerous, not physically dangerous, narratively dangerous. Because once fans begin questioning whether events are real, the entire structure starts shifting. One of the most famous examples came during his rivalry with Steve Austin. Today it's remembered as one of the most controversial storylines of its era. But at the time, it felt different, more intense, more personal, more unpredictable. And that's because Brian Pillman had spent years teaching audiences to doubt certainty. When strange things happened around him, people didn't automatically assume it was part of the show. They wondered, they questioned, they speculated. The famous home invasion angle became one of the defining moments of his career. For some fans, it was groundbreaking television. For others, it crossed a line. But almost everyone agreed on one thing. It felt different. It felt dangerous, and danger attracts attention. The scene itself became instantly memorable. Austin arrives. Tension escalates. The atmosphere grows increasingly chaotic. Then comes the moment that people still talk about decades later. The firearm, the confrontation, the sense that wrestling had entered territory where nobody was entirely comfortable. Today, audiences understand the context, the production, the storytelling, the planning involved. But in that moment, many viewers genuinely didn't know what they were watching. And that uncertainty amplified everything. Some believed wrestling was evolving. Others believed wrestling was losing control. The debate spread quickly, exactly the way debates always spread around Brian Pillman. No consensus, no agreement, only competing interpretations. And the more controversial the moment became, the larger the loose cannon legend grew. But while audiences focused on the character, real life was becoming increasingly complicated. Because behind the scenes, Brian Pillman was fighting battles the audience couldn't see. Battles that had nothing to do with storylines, nothing to do with ratings, nothing to do with wrestling psychology. Physical pain, injuries, recovery, frustration, pressure. The reality of professional wrestling eventually catches everyone. No matter how talented they are, no matter how creative they are, no matter how intelligent they are, the body keeps score. And Brian Pillman's body had already absorbed years of punishment, flying through the air, taking risks, traveling constantly, performing through pain. Like many wrestlers of that era, he wasn't working inside a system designed to protect performers. He was working inside a culture that often rewarded endurance, a culture where pain became normal, a culture where showing weakness could feel impossible, and that culture created its own kind of pressure. The audience saw the loose cannon. The audience saw unpredictability. The audience saw controversy. What they didn't always see was exhaustion, physical and emotional. Because wrestling is unique in one important way. When an actor struggles, filming eventually stops. When an athlete struggles, the season eventually ends. In wrestling, the next show is always coming. The next town, the next appearance, the next performance. The machine keeps moving, whether you're ready or not. And for someone already living inside uncertainty, that pressure can become overwhelming. Yet even as challenges mounted, the mythology kept growing, the rumors kept growing, the stories kept growing. People weren't just discussing Brian Pillman anymore. They were discussing what Brian Pillman represented. Some believed he was years ahead of the industry, a visionary who understood audience psychology before everyone else. Others believed the experiment had gone too far, that the line between performer and performance had become dangerously thin. Neither side fully won the argument, because both sides could point to evidence. And that's what makes this period of Pillman's life so fascinating. Every explanation feels incomplete. Every answer creates new questions. The closer people get to understanding him, the more complicated the picture becomes. One interview suggests complete awareness, another suggests genuine frustration. One story portrays confidence, another suggests vulnerability. One account describes control, another describes chaos, and all of them exist simultaneously, like different pieces of a puzzle that never quite lock together. That's why Brian Pillman's story survives. Not because it's simple, because it isn't. Not because it's easy to understand, because it isn't. It survives because uncertainty survives, because mysteries survive, because questions survive. And during this period of his life, questions surrounded him everywhere. Questions about his future, questions about his health, questions about his mindset, questions about where the character ended, questions about whether the character ever ended at all. The wrestling audience wanted answers. The wrestling industry wanted answers. But answers were becoming harder to find. And as the years moved forward, the mystery only deepened. Because by now, Brian Pillman wasn't just living inside wrestling's most unusual experiment. He had become inseparable from it. The man and the myth were beginning to overlap. The performer and the performance were becoming harder to distinguish. And when that happens, perspective becomes everything. Some people saw genius, some people saw warning signs, some people saw innovation, some people saw danger, and everyone believed their version was the correct one. Meanwhile, the clock kept moving forward. The schedule kept moving forward. The pressure kept moving forward. Whether anyone was ready for what came next or not. Because the final chapter of Brian Pillman's story wasn't approaching dramatically, it wasn't announced, it wasn't obvious, it arrived the same way most life-changing moments arrive. Quietly, gradually, one day at a time. And by the time people realized how close they were to the end was already there. By the fall of 1997, something had changed. Not just in Brian Pillman's career, not just in professional wrestling. Something had changed in the way people talked about him. The excitement was still there. The curiosity was still there. The mystery was still there. But underneath all of it, there was concern, real concern. And concern is different from rumor. Rumors create questions. Concern creates silence. People become careful. Conversations become shorter. Words become more deliberate. Because deep down, everyone understands that some stories stop being entertaining once real life enters the picture. And by late 1997, real life was becoming harder to ignore. For years, Brian Pillman had built a reputation around unpredictability. Fans never knew what he would say. Promoters never knew what he might do. Wrestlers never knew whether a conversation was completely serious or partly performance. That uncertainty became part of his identity, part of his legend, part of what made him compelling. But there is a strange danger that comes with living inside a character for too long. Eventually, people stop knowing how to talk about you. They stop knowing what concerns are real. They stop knowing what warnings matter. Because everything feels connected to the performance. And when everything feels like part of the act, people can miss what is actually happening. The human being behind the story, the person behind the persona, the reality behind the myth. By this point, Pillman's body had been through years of punishment, years of travel, years of injuries, years of trying to perform at a level that demanded constant sacrifice. Professional wrestling in the 1990s was not forgiving. The schedule was relentless. The expectations were relentless. The pressure was relentless. And unlike many other sports, there wasn't always an off-season. There wasn't always time to recover. There wasn't always time to heal. The next show was always waiting. The next town was always waiting. The next appearance was always waiting. For many performers, that lifestyle became normal. For others, it became a burden. The difficult part is that nobody experiences pressure the same way. Two wrestlers can live the exact same schedule and walk away with completely different stories. Two performers can endure the exact same environment and carry completely different scars. That's why hindsight can be so deceptive. Looking backward, people search for warning signs. They search for clues. They search for moments that explain everything. But life rarely works that way. Most tragedies don't arrive with obvious announcements. Most endings don't reveal themselves in advance. Instead, people only recognize the signs after they're already looking backward. And that's exactly what happened with Brian Pillman, because after his death, every interview was re-examined, every appearance was reconsidered, every story gained new significance. Suddenly, ordinary moments felt important, ordinary conversations felt meaningful, ordinary memories felt prophetic. The human mind does that. It tries to create order from uncertainty. It tries to build explanations. It tries to connect dots. Sometimes those connections are real, sometimes they're not. But they almost always appear after the fact, which creates another layer of mystery. How much did people actually know at the time? and how much only became visible afterward? That question still follows Brian Pillman's story, because the closer people get to the final days, the more complicated everything becomes. There are stories from friends, stories from co-workers, stories from family members, stories from wrestling insiders, and like so many parts of Brian Pillman's life, the details don't always align perfectly. Some remember optimism, some remember exhaustion, some remember ambition, some remember frustration. And perhaps the most unsettling part is that none of those memories necessarily contradict each other. Human beings are complicated, especially people living under pressure, especially people carrying physical pain, especially people trying to balance public expectations with private realities. The version one person sees isn't always the version another person sees. Brian Pillman may be one of the clearest examples of that truth in wrestling history, because throughout his career, different people described entirely different versions of the same man. And that continued right up until the end. The wrestling business itself was changing rapidly during this period. The Monday Night Wars were in full swing. Competition was fierce. Ratings mattered. Attention mattered. Momentum mattered. Everything felt accelerated. Every storyline needed to be bigger. Every rivalry needed to feel more personal. Every performer needed to stand out. And few performers stood out more than Brian Pillman. But standing out comes with its own cost. Being unforgettable requires energy. Being controversial requires energy. Being unpredictable requires energy. And eventually, energy becomes something you can run out of. The audience rarely sees that part. Fans see performances, fans see appearances, fans see interviews. They don't always see recovery. They don't always see exhaustion. They don't always see what happens when the cameras stop recording. And perhaps that's why so many wrestling stories feel tragic in retrospect. Because audiences experience the highlights. The people living those lives experience everything. The travel, the pressure, the expectations, the pain, the uncertainty. And uncertainty had become a permanent companion in Brian Pillman's story. Not just professionally, personally, emotionally, physically. The questions that once surrounded the character now seemed to surround the man himself. And the closer the calendar moved toward October 1997, the heavier those questions became. Nobody knew they were approaching the final chapter, at least not in the way history would remember it. Life rarely announces itself that clearly. People make plans. They schedule appearances. They think about tomorrow, because tomorrow feels guaranteed, until suddenly it isn't. And when that moment arrives, the story changes forever. For Brian Pillman, that moment was closer than anyone realized. Closer than the fans realized. Closer than the wrestling industry realized. Closer than many of the people around him realized. The loose cannon character had spent years creating uncertainty. But now a different kind of uncertainty was approaching. One that couldn't be explained through psychology. One that couldn't be explained through storytelling. One that couldn't be explained through wrestling. And once it arrived, nothing about Brian Pillman's story would ever be discussed the same way again. October 1997. For wrestling fans, it was another busy month in a rapidly changing industry. Storylines were evolving, rivalries were intensifying, promotions were fighting for viewers, and Brian Pillman was still part of that world. still making appearances, still planning for the future, still existing inside a business that rarely slows down long enough to notice how exhausted someone might be. That's one of the details people often forget when discussing tragedy. The future still existed, right up until it didn't. There were plans, expectations, conversations about what came next, because no one wakes up believing they're living the final chapter of their story. They wake up thinking about tomorrow. And by all accounts, Brian Pillman was still thinking about tomorrow. That's one reason his death hit the wrestling world so hard. It wasn't expected, not in the immediate sense, not in the way people later convinced themselves it should have been. The human mind has a habit of rewriting uncertainty after tragedy occurs. It wants warning signs, it wants explanations, it wants a roadmap. But real life rarely provides one. Instead, there are fragments, moments, memories, pieces of conversations that seem ordinary until history changes their meaning. Then suddenly, every detail feels significant. Every recollection feels important. Every memory feels like evidence. As the final weekend approached, Brian Pillman was preparing for another appearance, another event, another chapter in a career that had already become one of wrestling's most unusual stories. To fans, he remained the loose cannon, the unpredictable force, the mystery, the question nobody could answer. But behind every wrestling character is a human being. And human beings don't live inside storylines. They live inside reality, a reality that often remains invisible until something forces people to pay attention. On October 5th, 1997, that reality arrived. The news spread quickly, shockingly quickly. The kind of news that moves through locker rooms before it reaches television screens. The kind of news that silences conversations. The kind of news that people initially refuse to believe. Brian Pillman had died at the age of 35. 35. Even now, those two words carry weight. 35. Not nearing retirement, not reaching old age. 35. An age that feels impossibly young when viewed from a distance, and perhaps even more impossible when attached to someone whose personality felt larger than life. The reaction was immediate: confusion, shock, disbelief. Because despite the rumors, despite the controversy, despite the mythology, most people still assumed there would be another chapter, another appearance, another reinvention, another twist in the story. Instead, the story stopped. And that's what made it so difficult to process. Brian Pillman had spent years building uncertainty. Now, uncertainty surrounded his absence. Questions emerged immediately. How did this happen? What were the circumstances? What had the final days looked like? Could anyone have known? Could anyone have prevented it? Those questions weren't malicious, they were human. When tragedy strikes unexpectedly, people search for understanding. And understanding often proves difficult, especially when the person involved already existed inside layers of myth and speculation. Because Brian Pillman wasn't simply a wrestler. By 1997, he had become a symbol of unpredictability, a symbol of innovation, a symbol of blurred lines. And symbols are harder to let go of than people. People end, symbols continue. The wrestling world struggled to process the news because so much of Brian Pillman's identity had been built around uncertainty. For years, fans debated whether what they were seeing was real. For years, wrestlers debated what he was truly thinking. For years, promoters debated how much freedom was too much freedom. Then suddenly, those debates felt smaller. The mystery remained. But the man was gone, and that's a very different thing. In the days that followed, stories began resurfacing. Stories from friends, stories from colleagues, stories from rivals, memories that had once seemed ordinary, moments that had once seemed insignificant. People tried to explain Brian Pillman, and they discovered something interesting. Nobody could explain him the same way. One person remembered the brilliant innovator. Another remembered the fearless risk-taker. Another remembered the devoted friend. Another remembered the complicated personality. None of them were necessarily wrong. That's the strange part. The various versions didn't cancel each other out. They simply revealed different sides of the same individual, which is perhaps why Brian Pillman's legacy became so difficult to summarize. Most careers can be reduced to a sentence. Most wrestlers eventually fit inside a category: hero, villain, champion, legend. Brian Pillman resisted categorization even after death, because the mystery wasn't just attached to what he did, it was attached to who he was and who people believed he was. Those are not always the same thing. In the weeks following his passing, wrestling publications attempted to tell the story. Fans attempted to tell the story. Former co-workers attempted to tell the story. Yet no single version emerged. Only perspectives, interpretations, fragments. Some focused on the brilliance, others focused on the chaos. Some focused on innovation, others focused on warning signs. And perhaps that was fitting, because Brian Pillman had spent years creating a character built around uncertainty. A character built around refusing simple explanations. A character built around challenging assumptions. The tragedy is that even after the performance ended, the uncertainty remained, questions remained, debates remained. The story refused to settle into a neat conclusion, and maybe it never will, because certain figures in wrestling history become larger than biography, larger than statistics, larger than accomplishments. They become stories people continue telling, stories that evolve, stories that shift, stories that reveal more about the people discussing them than the person at the center. Brian Pillman became one of those stories, not because everything about him was mysterious, because enough of it was. Enough questions remained unanswered. Enough contradictions survived. Enough perspectives refused to align. And when that happens, a legacy stops being history. It becomes mythology. The challenge with mythology is that it often obscures reality. People remember the legend, the larger-than-life moments, the controversy, the rumors, the unforgettable scenes. They sometimes forget the human being beneath all of it, the person carrying responsibilities, relationships, dreams, pain, pressure, fear, hope. Because every legend starts as a person, and every myth eventually risks replacing the person entirely. That may be one of the saddest parts of Brian Pillman's story. The closer people get to understanding the myth, the further they sometimes move from understanding the man. And yet perhaps that tension is unavoidable. Because Brian Pillman spent years building a character designed to challenge certainty, a character designed to resist easy explanations, a character designed to make people question what they believed. In the end, people were still questioning. They just wished they weren't doing it under these circumstances. The wrestling world had lost one of its most fascinating minds, one of its most unpredictable personalities, one of its most difficult people to define, and now everyone was left trying to make sense of an ending that arrived far too soon. The questions didn't disappear. If anything, they became louder. Because now there would be no new interviews, no new appearances, no new reinventions, only memories, only stories, only interpretations. And interpretations have a way of multiplying over time, especially when the person involved spent a lifetime creating uncertainty. The mystery wasn't over. In many ways, it was just beginning. In the years that followed, something strange happened. Brian Pillman became more influential after he was gone. Not immediately, not all at once, but gradually, quietly. The wrestling industry began moving in directions that felt familiar. Reality and fiction blended together more aggressively. Promos became less scripted. Characters became more complex. Audiences became more aware of the business itself. The very things Brian Pillman had been experimenting with suddenly appeared everywhere. And with every passing year, people started asking the same question. Was he ahead of his time? Or was he simply the first person willing to push those ideas further than everyone else? The answer depends on who you ask. And that answer has changed repeatedly over the decades. Because the wrestling world never stopped trying to understand Brian Pillman. Books were written, documentaries were produced, interviews resurfaced, stories were retold, memories were revisited, and each new generation discovered the same thing. The deeper you go into Brian Pillman's story, the harder it becomes to find certainty. For every person who describes him as a misunderstood genius, another describes a man carrying burdens nobody fully understood. For every story about brilliant psychological manipulation, there is another story about real-life struggles. For every account that emphasizes control, there is another account that emphasizes chaos, and somehow, all of those versions continue existing side by side. Which brings us to the central mystery of Brian Pillman. Not how he died, not where he worked, not what championships he won. The real mystery is much simpler. Who exactly was Brian Pillman? That question sounds easy until you start trying to answer it. Was he Flyin Brian? The exciting young athlete redefining what smaller wrestlers could accomplish? Was he the Hollywood blonde? The sarcastic entertainer helping create one of wrestling's most memorable tag teams? Was he the loose cannon? The unpredictable force who blurred reality and fiction so effectively that audiences couldn't tell where either one began? Or was he all of them? And if he was all of them, how much of each version was performance? How much was personality? How much was experimentation? How much was reality? Those questions remain unanswered. And they may always remain unanswered. Because one of the uncomfortable truths about human beings is that we rarely fit inside simple definitions. We are complicated, contradictory, constantly changing. Brian Pillman may simply be one of the most visible examples of that reality. Yet wrestling fans continue searching for a final answer, a definitive explanation, a way to summarize everything. Because people prefer conclusions, people prefer certainty, people prefer stories that resolve neatly. Brian Pillman's story refuses to do that. It continues resisting resolution, even decades later. And perhaps that's exactly why it survives. Most wrestling careers eventually settle into history. The details become established. The debates become smaller. The narrative becomes stable. Brian Pillman's narrative never became stable. It remains active, still evolving, still being discussed, still being interpreted. because every generation sees something different when they examine his story. Older fans remember the confusion, the uncertainty, the shock of not knowing what was real. Younger fans often see innovation, a performer whose ideas feel surprisingly modern. Historians see influence, psychologists see complexity, storytellers see possibility. Everyone finds something different. And maybe that's because Brian Pillman left behind more than a wrestling career. He left behind a question that wrestling still struggles to answer. How real should wrestling feel? It's a question that defines entire eras. A question that drives creative decisions. A question that shapes how performers present themselves. And Brian Pillman spent years exploring that question before many others recognized its importance. That's why his influence remains difficult to measure. Some contributions can be counted: championships, main events, attendance figures, television ratings. Those things leave records. Brian Pillman's greatest contribution may have been an idea. And ideas don't leave statistics. Ideas leave echoes. They appear in other performers, other storylines, other promotions, other generations, sometimes openly, sometimes invisibly. The influence spreads regardless, which creates another strange irony. For years, Brian Pillman built a character around uncertainty. Yet one thing became increasingly certain after his death. His impact wasn't disappearing. If anything, it was growing. Because every time wrestling moved closer to reality, people remembered Brian Pillman. Every time audiences debated whether something was real, people remembered Brian Pillman. Every time performers blurred the line between character and person, people remembered Brian Pillman. His fingerprints remained visible, even when his name wasn't always attached. And that may be the strongest argument for his legacy. Not the controversy, not the rumors, not even the mythology, the influence, the fact that ideas he explored continue shaping wrestling decades later. But influence doesn't erase mystery. If anything, it often creates more. Because the larger Brian Pillman's legacy became, the more people wanted to understand him. The more they researched. The more they listened to interviews. The more they compared stories. The more they searched for the version that felt most accurate. And the more they searched, the more complicated the picture became. Maybe that's fitting. Maybe a man who spent years challenging certainty was never going to leave behind simple answers. Maybe a performer who blurred reality and fiction was always going to leave questions behind. Maybe the mystery isn't a flaw in the story. Maybe the mystery is the story. Because after all these years, fans still debate, historians still analyze, former co-workers still remember, and audiences still watch old footage searching for clues, searching for the moment when Brian Pillman became Brian Pillman, searching for the line between the man and the character, searching for an answer that may not exist. The truth is, there may never be a single explanation, no final revelation, no hidden piece of information that suddenly makes everything clear. There may only be perspectives, fragments, memories, stories, and perhaps that's enough. Because sometimes understanding a person isn't about solving them. It's about accepting that they cannot be fully solved. Brian Pillman was an athlete, a performer, a father, a friend, a risk taker, an innovator, a mystery. None of those descriptions tell the entire story. Together, they still don't tell the entire story. And that's what makes him unforgettable. Not because everyone agrees on who he was, because nobody does. The loose cannon spent years teaching wrestling audiences to question certainty. Decades later, they're still doing exactly that. And maybe that was the final lesson. Not that reality and fiction are impossible to separate, but that people are. Because behind every character is a human being. Complicated, contradictory, difficult to define. Brian Pillman spent his life resisting easy explanations. His legacy continues doing the same. And somewhere between the man, the myth, and the mystery, the story remains unfinished. Not because it lacks an ending, but because people are still trying to understand it. And perhaps they always will. Every wrestling generation has its ghosts, names that continue appearing long after the final match, names that seem to exist outside normal wrestling history. Not because of championships, not because of records, not because of statistics, because of questions. And Brian Pillman became one of wrestling's biggest questions. The strange thing about questions is that they survive longer than answers. An answer eventually settles. A question keeps moving, keeps changing, keeps finding new audiences. And that's exactly what happened here. More than 2 decades after his death, people still discover Brian Pillman's story for the first time. They watch old interviews, they watch old matches, they hear the stories, and almost immediately, they arrive at the same place everyone else arrives. Confusion, curiosity, fascination. Because Brian Pillman doesn't fit comfortably into wrestling history. He sits slightly outside of it. Like a puzzle missing just enough pieces to remain unsolved. Some people believe he was one of the smartest minds the business ever produced. Others believe he was a talented performer carrying burdens that eventually became too heavy. Some believe the loose cannon character was one of the greatest psychological experiments in wrestling history. Others believe the reality behind the character deserves more attention than the performance itself. And maybe all of them are right. Because human beings are rarely one thing. The longer a person lives, the more complicated they become. The more experiences they collect. The more contradictions they carry, the more difficult they become to summarize. Brian Pillman simply lived those contradictions in public. And perhaps that's why his story feels different. Most wrestling legends leave behind accomplishments. Brian Pillman left behind interpretations. Different people remember different versions of him, and every version reveals something important. The athlete, the innovator, the rebel, the entertainer, the risk taker, the father, the friend, the mystery, they all existed. They all mattered, and none of them fully explain the whole picture. That's what makes his story endure, because every generation believes it might finally solve the puzzle. Every generation believes it might discover the missing piece. Every generation believes it might find the definitive explanation. And every generation eventually discovers the same thing. There isn't one. There are only perspectives, fragments, memories, and questions. The wrestling business itself has changed dramatically since Brian Pillman's death. Entire eras have come and gone. Companies have risen and fallen. Stars have emerged and disappeared. The industry looks different, sounds different, operates differently. Yet somehow, parts of Brian Pillman remain visible, not always directly, sometimes in small ways. A performer breaking traditional rules, a storyline blurring reality and fiction, an audience questioning whether something is real, a wrestler creating uncertainty instead of certainty. Those moments feel familiar because Brian Pillman explored that territory long before many others. Today, fans use terms like worked shoot, reality-based storytelling, meta-narratives, blurring the line. Modern wrestling discussion are filled with ideas that feel completely normal now. But there was a time when those concepts felt unusual, uncomfortable, risky. And Brian Pillman willingly stepped into that discomfort. Whether he fully understood where it would lead, no one can say for certain. That's another unanswered question, one of many. And maybe that's why his story feels less like a biography and more like a conversation. A conversation that never truly ends, because every time someone revisits his career, new interpretations emerge. New conclusions, new theories, new debates. The discussion continues, the mystery continues, the legacy continues. And perhaps that is the most remarkable part of all. Not that people remember Brian Pillman. Many wrestlers are remembered. It's that people continue trying to understand him. Understanding requires effort, curiosity, attention. And Brian Pillman still commands all three, years after his final match, years after his final interview, years after his final appearance. That kind of impact is rare, because most performers eventually become history. Brian Pillman became something else, a story, a symbol, a question, and questions have a way of surviving. Maybe that's why the loose cannon character remains so compelling. Not because audiences ever fully understood it, because they didn't. The uncertainty became part of the appeal, part of the experience, part of the memory. People remember how it felt. The unpredictability, the tension, the possibility that something unexpected might happen at any moment. Those feelings remain powerful, even decades later. Especially decades later. Because memory often transforms uncertainty into mythology. The details blur, the emotions remain, and emotions are what stories survive on. Brian Pillman's story survives because people felt something. Confusion, excitement, admiration, concern, shock, curiosity. Those emotions attach themselves to his legacy, and they never completely disappeared. Perhaps they never will. As time moves forward, more wrestlers will emerge, more controversies will occur, more legends will be created. The business will continue evolving. It always does. Yet some names remain permanent fixtures in the conversation. Brian Pillman is one of them. Not because everyone agrees about him, because they don't. Not because his story is simple, because it isn't. Not because all the questions have been answered, because they haven't. His story survives precisely because uncertainty remains, and uncertainty has always been powerful. Powerful enough to create legends, powerful enough to sustain myths, powerful enough to keep conversations alive long after the people involved are gone. Brian Pillman understood uncertainty better than most. Whether intentionally or unintentionally, he built a legacy around it. A legacy that still challenges audiences, still sparks debates, still invites interpretation, still refuses to settle. And perhaps that's where we leave this story, not with a conclusion, not with a final answer, not with a perfect explanation. Because Brian Pillman's life doesn't lend itself to those things. Instead, we leave it where it has always existed. Somewhere between reality and performance. Somewhere between certainty and doubt. Somewhere between the man and the myth. Maybe Brian Pillman was ahead of his time. Maybe he was misunderstood. Maybe he was both. Maybe he was neither. The truth probably lives somewhere in the space between those answers. The same space where so much of his story exists. A space filled with questions, filled with contradictions, filled with possibilities, and filled with a legacy that refuses to disappear. Because long after the crowds went home, long after the camera stopped rolling, long after the final chapter was written, the conversation continued, and it continues still. Brian Pillman spent years teaching wrestling audiences to question what they were seeing, to doubt certainty, to challenge assumptions, to look beyond the obvious explanation. In the end, that may be the reason his story remains so powerful. Not because he gave people answers, because he left them with questions, and some questions never stop echoing. This has been Kayfabe Killers. And until next time, remember, in professional wrestling, the truth is often stranger than the storyline, and sometimes the most fascinating mysteries are the ones that never get solved.